Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Welcome to Practical Remote Editing Solutions for Video Production Teams. I am Melanie Ciotti, our marketing manager here at Studio Network Solutions. Today's webinar will focus on simple and practical solutions for creative teams that are working from home or in a hybrid in-studio and at-home model. We specify practical because that's what matters. Your remote editing solution has to be practical. It has to be something that's deployed quickly, that's easy to use, and that doesn't stifle productivity or creativity within your team. I know because that's what matters to my creative team here at SNS as we work remotely using the same tools that you'll learn about today. It's a pleasure to introduce to you my colleague, Steve Higdon. Steve has been with SNS for over 10 years, and he's been in the content creation industry for over 30 years. As a senior systems engineer and product specialist, Steve's superpower is solving workflow problems for content creators like you. And with more and more creatives working remotely these days, workflow problems have been on the rise across the industry. To help you overcome the challenges of remote workflow and to cut through the clutter and all the complex and convoluted options out there, here's my friend Steve Higdon with his take on practical remote editing solutions for video production teams.
Thanks, Melanie. We're here to talk about practical approaches to workflow, offline editing, editing at home, and SNS remote editing features. And by practical, I mean real techniques that you can put into practice to solve production problems that you're facing right now. If you're like most of us, the last few months have been marked by big changes in the way you're working. And often, those changes mean that you're no longer sitting in the same edit suite at the studio or at that same old desk in the office. Many of us are now working from remote locations. Maybe you've converted a spare bedroom or a desk in your basement, and now you're ready to start editing. But being separated from your old environment brings new challenges. Hopefully, we can help you meet those challenges with practical approaches to offline editing, remote editing, and the SNS remote editing workflow. First, let's jump right in and take a look at the basics of offline editing. So why offline editing? Well, this technique is really handy anytime your video files are just too big to carry, too big to copy, or maybe just too big to even play on your computer. Offline editing is really just 3 easy steps. Number 1, create proxies for your original video files. Number 2, edit using those proxies. And number 3, relink to the original media files when you're ready to export your full res master. Those proxies are important because they are smaller, more portable copies of your full res media files. The proxies are the offline files, and your full res are the online files. Editing offline simply means working with those proxies on your timeline. And the trick to keeping your production quality high is in that last step, where you relink back to the online media files and export a full res master. So you get the benefit of mostly dealing with the compact offline files without giving up the quality of the online files. In fact, for Media Composer, offline editing has been kind of baked into the workflow over the years. And SNS can offer some ways to take advantage of offline workflow in all the popular editing software, where offline editing isn't necessarily the default. And the good thing is that most of those NLEs make it fairly easy to switch between online and offline files, like the toggle proxies function in Adobe Premiere Pro shown here. So with one click, you can link the clips on your timeline to the small, lightweight proxies, or back to the original full-res video files. Storing, moving, and playing those compact proxy files is easier and faster than dealing with the full-res files throughout the entire process. Of course, this technique has been around for a while. In fact, sometimes it was the only way to work. Anytime the original source files have grown too cumbersome, offline editing has been an effective way to get the work done. And if we look back at the SD to HD transition, codecs, computers, and networks sometimes weren't up to the task of online editing. Then later, as 4K, 6K, and 8K resolution began to again push the bandwidth higher and higher, sometimes offline editing was the only way to effectively integrate those larger files into the workflow. And now, when so many of us need to work remotely, offline workflow comes to the rescue again, reducing the amount of data that we have to copy, move, upload, and download. Because even if your files aren't 8K or 16K or more, the problem is now that we're often physically separated from our files. And all your media assets are at the office or at the studio, but much of the production team is now working from home. So now more than ever, remote editing is high on everyone's priority list. We all need efficient ways to get the work done from home. And getting access to your media files can seem pretty daunting. But you're familiar with offline editing, and maybe you've used these techniques in the studio. So let's look at ways we can integrate offline editing now that you're working from home. Among the challenges for remote editing are having to deal with so many huge files, working with slow or inconsistent internet speeds, high latency across the WAN, intermittent reliability, and of course, security is always a major concern. And these aren't the only difficulties that you're facing. For example, many of us don't have enhanced internet services in our homes. We're just dealing with a regular residential internet account, just like the hundreds of other ISP customers in your neighborhood. And with more people in many industries now working from home, I'm willing to bet that your internet service provider's network equipment is running closer to maximum usage these days. Even if you do have enhanced service, you may not always be getting the full use of that increased speed. The fact is, everyone is fighting for their own slice of internet bandwidth, and that might even include your own kids in a distance learning session in the next room. And there are many approaches to remote editing that we've seen recently, including remote desktop schemes, complex workflows based on media or digital asset management systems, as well as PC over IP and remote graphics approaches like Teradici and HPZ. But those solutions are often hampered by long deployment timelines, very high initial and ongoing costs, complexity and steep learning curves, and in some cases, a lack of Mac OS compatibility. And yet they still rely on fast and consistent internet connectivity, which, as we've all experienced, sometimes just isn't readily available. The better answer may very well be Studio Network Solutions Nomad. With short deployment timelines, Nomad is included free with Evo, so you can integrate offline editing with no per-seat license fees. And of course, it works with Mac OS, Windows, and all the major nonlinear editing software. So let's look at some details on the SNS remote editing workflow. The first piece is to have an SNS Evo at your studio. Even if your media production team isn't currently working at the facility, you still need a secure way to store your files. And with Evo, you get a bunch of stuff you need: high performance, built-in media asset management, data backup and replication features, cloud, AI, and remote work from home tools. Of course, all the included software comes free in unlimited fashion with no per seat licensing. SNS has customers all over the world in many different industries that are working remotely with Evo and Nomad. Film, video, VFX, audio, music, sports, education, worship and ministry, news, gaming, esports, corporate communications, municipal, military, and government organizations. Pretty much every industry you can think of has the need to create media content, and they use SNS Evo solutions to help them get the job done. And included with every Evo is Share Browser, Media Asset Management. Share Browser brings enhanced search capabilities and custom user metadata features to not only your hands-on content creators, but also your producers, media managers, and other people who are integral to your team. And with Evo and Share Browser in the game, you can also leverage Nomad for remote editing. Because Evo and Share Browser are always working in the background to create preview proxies, you're already poised to go remote with offline editing. You just need to use Nomad to download those proxies so you can quickly begin working remotely. So here's how it works. Your full res and proxy media lives on your Evo at the office or studio. And when you're ready to go remote, Nomad finds all the relevant media that you need and assembles a nice portable package for you. You simply tell Nomad what project you're working on, and you can simply point Nomad to a project folder that contains your full res media files. Or you can give Nomad your Premiere project file that already has references for your full res media. Nomad will identify the online files in that Premiere project and then locate the matching proxy files. So with Nomad's help, you download your proxy files. And then it's a familiar offline editing workflow after that. And at that point, you could even work without any internet connection at all. So Nomad is simply helping you quickly and easily get the files you need to edit from home. If you run Nomad while you're at the office, you can easily copy your offline files to a portable drive, tuck it in your backpack, and hit the road. Or you may already be connected to your office using a remote desktop utility or a VPN, in which case you can just download your Nomad offline files to the computer in your home edit suite or to your laptop on location or in a hotel room or wherever you may be. And now I'd like to talk about another tool that makes this remote workflow even easier. SNS VPN is a cloud service that gives each customer your own virtual private network that ties together your Evo with your production team, wherever they are. It's easy to set up, easy to use, and easy to manage. And like the rest of the SNS solutions, there's no per seat pricing, and SNS VPN can accommodate an unlimited number of users. But let's take a step back for a moment and talk about VPN. You might already know this, but we get a lot of questions about it. So I'll take a couple of minutes here to address some of the questions and some misconceptions. What is it? A VPN, or virtual private network, acts as a secure tunnel connecting your remote workstation on your home Wi-Fi or any public internet connection to the private network at your office or studio. But you may ask, isn't VPN a technique for data privacy? Well, yeah, it can be used that way. And you may have heard that a VPN scatters your IP addresses so that people and bots and governments, et cetera, can't track your phone or web history. And that's somewhat true, but that's a different use and really a different kind of VPN. In our case, the primary purpose of a VPN is to give your team secure access to the in-studio private network when they're connected to an out-of-studio public one. Now, your Evo will work with any properly configured VPN that you set up in your network, but they're not all created equal. We've built SNS VPN with specific features to enhance the remote editing and creative process, making it super easy to use, whether you have a dedicated IT department or zero technical and IT background whatsoever. Setting up a traditional VPN requires installing a dedicated server in your office network and modifying some firewall configurations. These firewall settings are critical to keeping your network secure. Each remote user will then need a security credential on their computer to gain access. And once they're logged in, the remote computers have access into the office network. When set up correctly, a VPN is the preferred secure way to enable remote users to interact with your private network. But not every company can set up a VPN. Not everyone has the technical expertise or the budget. Or it might just be too complicated to get the corporate IT department on board with the whole idea. And remember, in addition to setting up the VPN hardware, you'll also have to configure your firewall to allow external access. That's the firewall that's responsible for protecting your private network and your data and your customers' data. A mistake at this step could be costly. But the SNS VPN service is fundamentally different, and that makes the prospect of using this technology so much easier. In our case, each customer gets their own unique instance of the SNS VPN cloud service. Because the service is hosted in the cloud, there's no longer any requirement to buy and set up a dedicated server, and there's no need to program firewall rules. Once your Evo joins the SNS VPN cloud service, it's then available to any of your remote team members who also join the VPN. So the whole team, both in the office and in the field, have secure access to the workflow. The unique thing here is that your Evo joins the SNS VPN as a client, the same way that your remote users join the VPN. And that greatly simplifies things and avoids so many of the problems of a traditional in-network hardware VPN. For example, a traditional VPN can expose all of the devices on your private network to those remote users. But the SNS VPN is only connecting your Evo with your remote production team, leaving the rest of your office network isolated and secure. We've had customers tell us that their company already has a VPN, but it doesn't include their media server. So that doesn't really address their current remote editing requirement. One of the best things about the SNS VPN is that it can live separately from the rest of your IT infrastructure. It doesn't conflict with any other VPN that might be running in your facility. The cloud-hosted service can be up and running in a matter of hours with the help of our remote commissioning service. And you can easily manage unlimited clients through the user-friendly web console without getting your IT people involved. So if you need to add a freelancer for 1 week, you don't have to go through a ton of technical changes. You can add and revoke privileges very easily in the web portal. Again, not getting your IT people involved. So back to those remote workflow challenges. The long timelines, the high costs, the compatibility issues, and the reliance on continued and sustained internet connectivity. The SNS remote workflow can be deployed in hours instead of weeks, and the costs remain low and controlled, even for unlimited users. You get compatibility with both Mac and Windows operating systems, and an easy to understand, easy to use remote editing workflow. It's based on a familiar offline editing process. With the Evo Nomad SNS VPN environment, you've got all the pieces to the puzzle. Evo works in the background to create your proxy files. Nomad extracts those files into portable packages, and SNS VPN delivers those files to your remote workstations for offline editing. This is a practical, ready-to-go solution. It's been adopted by many customers who look at it not as a temporary gap solution, but as a long-term enhancement to the future of their workflow. 3 months from now or 6 months from now, your team may or may not be working from the office. But whether you're in the office, remote, or some combination of the two, the SNS remote editing workflow is available and ready to handle it. So we have customers all over the world in all different industries. And these are a few early adopters who started using Nomad back in March. And their teams have been working remotely ever since. Here's Kelly from Stream Companies, Robert from Media Source, and Jeremy from Mayday Productions. And they all started using Nomad very early on. Now that we've covered offline editing, remote editing, and the practical solution that SNS has to help you work from home, let's talk about the other aspects of your workflow that you still need, whether you're working remotely or in the studio. No matter where you are, good workflow needs practical solutions for media asset management, automation, backup, and security. And it has to work with the NLEs that you're using. So let's take a look at some practical solutions for any workflow, remote or in studio. Share Browser is Evo's built-in media asset management software. It's powerful and easy to use, and it's included free with Evo in unlimited fashion. So whether you have 5 or 50 editors, there is no additional cost per user. With Share Browser, you can search, index, tag, comment, and preview your media files. You can even index and search other storage, like another server or that portable hard drive that's sitting on the shelf. You can browse offline storage with metadata and previews. And you can organize files into custom bins without duplicating, moving, or breaking any links to your media. It really is a practical solution for asset management because it's so easy to use. Does everything a powerful MAM should, and it's included free with no per-seat licensing. Evo and Share Browser integrate well into the production applications that you use. You get a Share Browser panel integrated right into Adobe Premiere and After Effects, as well as an extension in Final Cut. There's metadata export for DaVinci Resolve, and Evo can even host the Resolve collaborative database. And speaking of collaboration, Evo works perfectly with Avid Media Composer and Pro Tools. Evo includes slingshot automation features, so you can schedule data replication jobs that will automatically back up your files to another location or to a cloud service. And you can filter which files you want to back up or transfer. So you could back up your MOV files every weekend or copy your project files every night. You can schedule your automations to run however you'd like. And if you want to get really complex, we have a robust API that developers and software integrators can use to build even more advanced automations. All these tools are accessible both remotely and in the studio using the remote editing tools we discussed earlier, like SNS VPN. The entire Evo suite of software tools, that's Share Browser, Slingshot, and Nomad, all come with unlimited user licenses. So your solution is ready to grow with your team. And you always have our support. SNS includes free basic lifetime support with all Evo purchases. And if you purchase our standard or premium level of support, all your software updates are included at no extra cost. If you need it, you can also get remote commissioning and remote training services to help you get started with your new workflow. And this last item is something that really makes a difference when talking about practical solutions. At SNS, our engineers are constantly working on solving tomorrow's workflow challenges. That's why we're able to release Nomad quickly back in March before widespread stay-at-home orders were announced. We're always listening to our customers and anticipating their needs. And that allows us to deliver truly practical solutions to the challenges they face in content creation. And you can take advantage of Nomad by upgrading your workflow today. Current Evo customers can activate Nomad by contacting the SNS support team. You can open a support case online or send an email to support@studionetworksolutions.com. If you're not an Evo customer yet, but would like to upgrade your workflow, our desktop units start at $37.99 for a great remote editing starter kit. We have various products that fit your every need: 1U, 2U, 4U, short depth, desktop, and nearline systems. Our remote server solutions are scalable and ready to grow with you up to multiple petabytes of high performance shared storage. And as a recap, keep in mind that Evo is much more than shared storage. It's a complete workflow solution for post-production, broadcast, and VFX teams. You get the Evo high-performance remote server, plus powerful and easy-to-use media asset management with Share Browser, robust file automation and API integration with Slingshot, and of course, Nomad, our remote editing utility. All these software tools are included free in unlimited fashion for all new Evos. And our products are scalable to accommodate your storage and workflow needs, from the small Evo Prodigy desktop unit shown here to multiple 16-bay Evos and Evo Nearline units with petabyte expandability. If you'd like to get a personalized demo of Evo and the full software suite, including Share Browser, Slingshot, Nomad, and if you want more information about SNS VPN, head on over to snesevo.com and contact us for more information.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you again to everyone who tuned in today. We really appreciate you sharing your time with us and hope that you learned some practical remote editing solutions for video production teams.